Good afternoon and welcome to this second in a series of webinars by Mott MacDonald. My name is Phil Redman. I'm the Area Director for Mott MacDonald in the North East. Today's webinar is titled Planning for Uncertainty, and we'll look at the challenges the transport sector faces with regard to future strategies and initiatives. We're joined today by Glenn Lyons, Professor of Future Mobility at the University of West England in Bristol, and Annette Smith, a Technical Director here within Mott MacDonald and part of our integrated transport team. We're also joined by Graham Grant, Head of Transport Investment at Newcastle Council, and he'll give us his view on those future challenges and touch on some of the initiatives being developed at a local level. As usual, we'll make some time at the end of this session for some Q&A, and on the right-hand side of the screen, you should see a function to allow you to ask questions during the presentations. And I'll look to facilitate those questions to our panel at the end. So please use that function and use the like function there as well to highlight any questions posed by others, as I'll try to ask those questions in order of the most popular. Any questions that we don't get around to answering, we'll look to try and respond to via email or social media after this event. Okay, so I think that lines us up nicely for the first of our speakers. So I will hand over to Glenn. Over to you, Glenn.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. So I only have a single slide, which I'll leave there for you as a backdrop. But I want to focus on, first of all, taking us back before we look to the future. So perhaps you are thinking about a long-term strategy out to 2050. So you're looking 30 years ahead. So now imagine we're back in 1990, 30 years ago. The web has not quite yet been invented. A mobile phone, if you have one, only makes phone calls. Even 10 years into the future, at the turn of the millennium, only a quarter of UK households will have access to the internet. But for most, this will consist of dial-up access, meaning it would take them 30 to 40 hours to download one movie. Though in 1990, you're probably not even aware of that possibility. And I doubt you're imagining 4 or 5G mobile internet access and what might become possible through that regarding societal interactions and consequences. Well, you're still in 1990, and I want you to consider two things. What would happen if we had a pandemic in 1990 that meant that we were locked down? How many could work from home? What would we do at home? How would we stay in touch, and where and how would we do our shopping? And the second thing, if instead of a pandemic, a futurist in 1990 told you that in 30 years' time, the UK would be in turmoil facing a pandemic, exit from the EU, and a climate emergency, would you take that seriously and consider it a plausible future? Would you believe them if they said that most people would be connected to a rich online world where they could talk to each other on screen through their devices, stream movies and order shopping and other items online as they work from home? So fast forward to that future that is now our present. What can we say about how we should be planning for the future today? Pre-COVID, there was already a growing acknowledgement of being deeply uncertain about the future. The pandemic has underlined this, and goodness knows, this week especially epitomizes the unsettled nature of the world right now. Before the pandemic, we were already in a state of flux in relation to mobility, brought about by the digital age colliding and merging with the motor age. My own view is that society and mobility have been in a period of regime transition for some 2 decades now, as the motor age of old destabilizes and we experience a decades-long process of change towards a different regime. Now in the pandemic, we've talked of the new normal, as if somehow we will emerge from this and things will settle relatively quickly into a new and stable regime. This seems unlikely to me. And there may be further system shocks to follow the pandemic that leave us thinking about a new normal, or new normal squared. I won't even go into new normal cubed. What we've seen from the pandemic is that it's possible to adapt as circumstances change, and this signals opportunity to decide on future circumstances that shape behaviours. it highlights an important distinction in transport planning, namely between demand-led supply and supply-led demand. We've focused too much on demand-led supply, predict and provide, when all along it's been as much, if not more, about supply-led demand. By changing circumstances, we change how people respond. What the pandemic also revealed is an important truth about the 21st century world we inhabit. It's not all about transport, not that it ever was. What underpins economic prosperity and social well-being is access, the ability to reach people, jobs, goods, services, and opportunities. We live in what I call a triple access system. The transport system enables access through motorised mobility. The land use system enables access through spatial proximity and active travel. And the telecommunications system enables access through digital connectivity. And thank goodness we have the triple access system. It offers resilience and flexibility in the face of a system shock. In the case of COVID, the transport system shrank in terms of its ability to provide access. Instead, many of us moved to an existence of living local and acting global, relying upon spatial proximity and digital connectivity much more. Each of our experiences of the pandemic are different, of course. For myself, I've replaced planes, trains, and automobiles with wires, walking, and family. Yet the work I'm doing and the people I'm doing it with are much the same. So bringing all this together, what does it mean for our forward planning? Firstly, we need to plan for future access, not only future transport. Secondly, the future is deeply uncertain. A forecast won't do away with the uncertainty and may instead give a false sense of security. We need to expose and embrace uncertainty, and this can be done through scenario planning. But thirdly, we can and do also influence the future. This is about being vision-led, identifying future outcomes we'd like to try and realise, and then setting a course towards achieving them, but a course that can negotiate the uncertainty. When taken together, we've called such an approach to forward planning decide and provide. To decide on a preferred accessibility future and outcomes, and provide a means to move towards it in a way that accommodates the deep uncertainty ahead. Decide and provide must now address decarbonisation. We need access to tread much more lightly if we are to achieve a net zero carbon economy by 2050. In effect, we're dealing with a large scale and legally binding case of decide and provide. Necessity is the mother of invention, and we must, as a transport sector, rise to the challenge of the times we're living through and be prepared to change how we think and act as transport planners and policymakers. We need a new normal to establish itself in terms of how we plan for the future and the investment decisions that follow. This is already happening, and I encourage you to embrace the transport planning transition. Indeed, I firmly believe that stewardship over the future now calls for a move from transport planning to what I call triple access planning. And with that, I'll pass over to my colleague Annette Smith to provide further insights into how we're going to put this into practice, and indeed are already doing so. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. That's great. Hi, everybody. I want to just put a bit more flesh on what Glenn has just been talking about and give a bit more background to vision-led strategic planning, because as Glenn said, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed how we travel and how we live. I want to talk today about the uncertainty of future mobility, but also within that where the opportunities lie. And then talk about how we can realise those opportunities, particularly through developing vision-led strategies. And then a slide that I won't go through, but is there at the back of this deck that we will circulate to you, is all about further information and where you can find a bit more detail again. So in terms of the uncertainty of future mobility, we have been living with this uncertainty pre-2020, and there's lots of kind of different uncertainties that as an industry we're juggling with and will continue to juggle with as we move through the next stages of COVID-19. And these are kind of underlying in relation to the environment, our need to decarbonise. There are issues in relation to air quality and our legal obligations that we have to improve air quality. There are uncertainties around trade deals at the moment, particularly in relation in the UK to Brexit. And there's also changes in lifestyle that we've all experienced pre-COVID, but also, you know, particularly during COVID in relation to how we access goods and how we shop. And COVID itself and how we travel and how we're allowed to travel is causing huge uncertainty for us. And then in that bottom right hand box there, that's an illustration of just how uncertain we are in relation to technology. Glenn spoke about how technology has massively changed our lifestyles and how we can live. But if we dig a bit more into technology, there's loads of stuff about technological innovation that we are grappling with. How are we going to embrace things like autonomous vehicles? How are we going to provide for electric vehicles? How are people going to travel, access information in relation to connected and shared mobility? And so we have all these different kind of within all the uncertainties, we have different layers of uncertainty. And a further layer of uncertainty that we have, particularly in relation to technology, is just pace of change. And, you know, Glenn has mentioned just how rapid technologies have come into our lives, and all these different logos that we're all so familiar with just enable us to see how they've changed our life, many for the good, and thank goodness for Netflix during COVID-19, but many for the good, but also just how we as an industry can embrace different technologies and how it can change how we travel. And we have, you know, difficulty, I guess, in terms of thinking about how rapidly are things going to change in the next 30 years as well. So all these different levels of uncertainty are part of our daily lives and our daily jobs. This graph here is a graph from the US, and it shows the relationship between total vehicles travelled and GDP. And it just illustrates the uncertainty that we've been talking about, but then how it then plays out in relation to how we actually travel. And until 1995, there was a close relationship between GDP growth and growth in vehicle miles. But this has really kind of been decoupled in the last few decades, and we think for a number of different reasons. And Glenn talked about a regime transition, and this is really very much what he's talking about, a kind of a collision of the automobile age with the digital age. And you can see that we think that this changes are in relation to societal changes that I've been that we were discussing just now, things like changes in work and how in terms of economic activity, some of the growth that we are experiencing doesn't require an increase in travel. But you can see in particular at the bottom of that graph, you can just see the acceleration and the pace of change in relation to internet use. And so we're already seeing back in 2017, just 3 years ago, the change that we were seeing in relation to travel. And it will be very interesting to see how that changes even more as a result of the global pandemic. So those are some of the kind of uncertainties that we're facing, but within that, we really believe that there's opportunities as well for future mobility. And this is the triple access system that Glenn was talking about, the importance of considering how to plan for future access and not just plan for future transport. And this triple access system shows how accessibility is achieved by different ways, by physical mobility, by spatial proximity, and also by digital connectivity. And as an industry, we've often talked about the importance of the integration of transport and land use. And increasingly over the last couple of decades, we've talked about the potential for digital connectivity as well. The challenge has been for us, and the opportunity has been for us during 2020, is realising that the impact of COVID-19 has been for us in relation to triple access has meant that the telecommunications system in particular and the spatial proximity of people to their locations has brought about a different kind of accessibility for people. And so we've developed a little animation here to illustrate to you what this looks like at the moment for us. So I just want to play this for you. So you can see from that animation how we have watched and seen the different levels of importance during COVID-19 of the land use system and the telecommunications system in order for people to access their goods. And as we've mentioned, it's been a case of living local and acting global. But we've got a real decision to make as policymakers and as practitioners to think, what do we want the future to look like? There's a real drive for people to want to change how they've lived and how they access goods. We've done a bit of work to look at what is the reality of triple access, and we've looked at some of the data from the Northeast, particularly looked at the traffic and accident data unit data, which has 600 automatic traffic and cycle counters across the region. We've also looked at Nexus's insight panel, and this has revealed some of the following data just to demonstrate how people are really embracing this triple access system in terms of how their lifestyles have adapted during COVID-19. So in terms of the transport system, across the Northeast, we've seen decreases in motor vehicle traffic of between 35 to 65% during April 2020. And I think regardless of where you live, we all experience drops in vehicle traffic during lockdown. But even now we're seeing that there are lower levels of traffic than there is normally in 2020 during the autumn. Public transport has suffered though, and we're also seeing less than 50% of patronage compared to normal at current times. And this is obviously going to be further impacted by the current national lockdown that we're experiencing. And we're seeing different journey patterns as well. So we're seeing much less peaks during the morning and the evening, but we're seeing different travel patterns during the day and perhaps increased travel in the afternoon. So our transport system is in a state of flux. In terms of land use, we've seen spatial proximity become really important for people. During April 2020 in the Northeast, we saw doubling or quadrupling of cycle numbers at certain count locations compared to the same period last year. And we've seen cycling now, it has increased between 50 and 100% compared to normal times. And a panel survey found that around a third of respondents are walking a lot more. So we're seeing people living locally and being able to use these types of modes much more readily. And then in terms of the telecommunications system, we've seen working from home increase, and across the Northeast, that's increased from 4% to 27%, and online shopping has increased to from 19% to 31%. But importantly, looking at the future, people think that they're going to shop less physically. They also think they're going to work from home more. And so there's a real challenge for us to think about how can we embrace these adoptions of new behaviours, but also to achieve a good future and a good life for our cities and for our residents and employees. So there's a real opportunity here for us to change the mobility system and to switch it to think about access and how people want to access. A quote that was cited recently at a Nexus conference is, "There are no comparable historic references from which to predict how the economy and labour market will rebound in the years ahead." And that presents to us a challenge, but it also presents to us an opportunity that we can be much more vision-led and actually create the path ahead and think, what do we want for the future, and start to provide for that future. And so that's why we think that realising the opportunity is about developing vision-led strategies. The importance of this is obviously critical around net zero and the need to develop a net zero carbon economy and to decarbonise our transport. The challenge is huge. we can't look to the past to work out how to do this. It requires a completely different way of living for us. Some cities in the UK have set carbon budgets, cumulative carbon budgets for themselves for the next 80 years. And what they've worked out is that within those 80 years, they would actually use the way they currently operate their city, they would use that carbon budget up in 7 years. And so the change has to be significant and the vision has to be big and has to be aspirational. So this is why we talk about a need to decide and provide, and we look at how can we create shared visions for cities and towns and rural areas to enable us to direct the future. Looking in the rearview mirror is no longer a solution to achieve the challenges that we have before us, but also the opportunity and the experience that we've had with COVID-19 perhaps gives us some new tools in order to achieve the future that we want. A place that has already begun to grapple with this is the Welsh Government. I thought this was a really interesting kind of vision approach that they'd taken, where in September 2020, when Westminster were calling everybody to get back to work, the Welsh Government set this target for themselves, that 30% of the Welsh workforce would work remotely. And that's not just during COVID-19, that is beyond COVID-19. They recognise that this opportunity that digital connectivity brings means that we can start to address other challenges around carbon and health and well-being in order to ensure that we come out of COVID-19 in a stronger economic and environmental and social position. But how do you get to reaching a kind of a statement like that? Well, at Mott MacDonald, we use a toolkit that we've developed called Futures. Futures is designed to decide on the future you want and to develop a resilient strategy to take you there. It's a 6-stage approach, and it takes a lot of collaborative work with stakeholders and workshops in order to develop a shared vision. We work with stakeholders to discuss with them what the opportunities are, what the challenges are, and then we take them to discussing what their preferred future is. And we then also look at scenario planning and options to take us to the vision, to realise the vision that they've set out. And we test those options against future scenarios to ensure that they're resilient to the uncertainties that we face. And so one of the thoughts that we have in relation to triple access planning is to think about moving from transport planning to triple access planning. And here is just some thoughts in relation to where we're already making progress. And so in terms of the land use system, as transport planners, we need to start thinking about spatial proximity, and there's work already ongoing in relation to 20-minute cities, and I just wonder whether there are opportunities for us to set ourselves some challenging targets that will enable us to decarbonise our economy, but some challenging targets in relation to percentage of the population who live within 10 minutes of key services in terms of accessibility, and whether that target can increase year on year so that we actually move towards more sustainable urban and rural areas. In relation to the transport system, are there targets that we can develop in relation to single occupancy vehicle use and ensure that these are reduced year on year? And again, like the Welsh Government have done, are there targets that we can set for our urban and rural areas in terms of workforces working remotely? And the Futures Toolkit enables us to think about these types of things, how we would set that vision, what options we'd need to deliver them and to test them against future scenarios. So I just wanted to leave you with this quote from the ICE and from Greg Marsden earlier this year that said, "Society is in the middle of proving that parts of the economy do not need to travel anywhere near as much to keep functioning." And I think it's our role as transport planners and within the transport industry to address that uncertainty and to realise the opportunities that this could present to our regions, our cities, our towns and our villages. I'm going to hand over now to Graham, who's going to talk to us about the Newcastle area for us.
Hi there. Sorry, I think I had a technical issue. So thanks for taking the time out to be part of this webinar. Two really interesting perspectives so far. Hopefully mine will be of some use before questions. It's likely to be based more in the reality, or my reality as far as I see it, of trying to achieve vision-based change on one city's public highway and how we as local authorities manage this process alongside support from the private sector. My name is Graham Grant. I lead the team responsible for transport at Newcastle City Council. Move on. But I'm also known as the man responsible for this totally unnecessary scheme, or at least by some people within the authority area. So what I'd note is that while some feel I'm responsible, I'm actually part of a team of 226 people in transport. This scheme, considered to be unnecessary by the person who decided to ghost my LinkedIn profile, print off my profile picture, laminate it and stick it up on various bits of public infrastructure like traffic signal controllers and bus shelters, was a cycle route and upgraded crossings aligned with a reduction in speed limit that was designed to connect a huge housing development in the far north of our city to other protected cycling infrastructure linking to other areas, including the city centre. It also acted as a means of providing a protected route that would enable young people to have a decent cycling route into the new housing development where new schools would be built. I guess underpinning my rationale for including this as a slide is the fact that not only is it a light way to start, it's also a good way of showing that regardless of whether or not a scheme is vision-led, it will not be universally popular and hard decisions are required. That fact is going to be a key theme in considering how to deliver vision-led challenges. And I'd state simply and clearly at the outset that without strong political leadership, what we can achieve in placemaking will always be compromised. I'm fortunate in that I work in an authority where we've got strong political leadership on these matters, but perhaps I can help others understand how that position developed and solidified. I'd also note that our ability to make more wide-ranging changes more recently than some other authorities have perhaps built on the foundations of politicians and officers, recognising that regardless of what we do, we'll face different perspectives and varying levels of vitriol. In the context of this presentation and discussion, and in terms of planning for uncertainty, the reality is the future has always been unwritten. Now is no different. It's understandable that it feels more uncertain, but just as Glenn indicated earlier through the examples he used, it's always been completely up for grabs. The reality is we can be more certain of a couple of things. The first is that the pace of change will be significantly greater, and the second is that recent experiences make it clear that austerity does not drive economic recovery. So my use of an image of Joe Strummer in The Clash here isn't just because there's a great documentary about him called The Future is Unwritten, or that a degree of punk spirit may be required to successfully move to a vision-led perspective. Clash as a word can help represent the many trade-offs we work in given the competing and conflicting requirements of the transport networks we oversee and what people want of them. We need to accept that even before this pandemic, our transport system nationwide was not adequately promoting sustainable or active ways of getting around in a way that supported the economy, minimised social inequalities, and led to ecological improvements. As we emerge into whatever comes next, we also need to contend with the biggest changes to employment and working patterns that most of us will have ever seen in our working lives, a massive reset in retail and hospitality services, and then the economic, social and ecological impacts of both required air quality measures and the spectre of climate change and commitments to carbon neutrality. In that context, it's good that as well as having said that the future is unwritten, Joe Strummer is also quoted as having said, people can change anything they want to, and that means everything in the world. But then why is it as a profession that we found it so hard to comprehensively address a national framework that favours demand-led supply in certain areas and on certain modes? Again, you know, a focus or part of the theme of these presentations is that you go backwards and forwards. And looking back, we can see that many of the problems that have been created were predicted early on. Our approaches to business case development and economic modelling based on central cases and using sensitivity tests to determine how they perform and other features is not really compatible with a vision-led system. Despite upgrades and changes that seek to redress the balance, the reality is that the current system still benefits certain areas and certain modes, and it certainly favours a demand-led approach, not vision-led. As we all know, the interaction between people and places is complex. When it comes to business case development, however, and particularly the economic modelling that gives you the all-important BCR, every single person or passenger car unit that you can see darting about on your screen there, or flickering depending on my internet connection, is a number. When I was doing my masters, we were taught about the methods of economic appraisal of transport schemes, and then we were immediately told by the same tutor that when we were in positions to determine what we were doing, we should ignore most of those appraisal methodologies and ensure we created ways of delivering what was right. But the issue there in terms of planning for uncertainty is that we can't just do that. Or if we did, we'd run the very real risk of having no money to implement the changes we need to see anyway. So there's always this requirement to look to the future while playing the game of the present. And this gives consideration of local determination versus assurance frameworks, really. Some would argue that there's significantly more opportunity for local determination these days, and I'm not arguing that there isn't. Hopefully the forthcoming white paper on local recovery and English devolution takes it further, because the reality is also that those national frameworks for modelling and business cases are also underpinned by the need to seek value for money. So the funding devolved to regional decision makers is still accompanied by a need to implement an assurance framework that requires us to use all the aforementioned means of determining value for money, and generally then noting we shouldn't spend money on things that don't deliver very high value for money. We have to question and challenge ourselves as a profession about whether or not we're adequately supporting our own ambitions to move towards a vision-led approach in the context of the change that is going to be coming at us. Because it's not just the professional challenges we face, it's the time pressures as individuals in both delivering a high quality of work and having a life outside of work, particularly now where you don't know if you're working from home or living at work. We should be doing everything we can to make this type of approach easier to realise, not something that requires endless iterations or workarounds to technical requirements that we or others in our profession have placed in our way. And I don't mean to sound too negative, because one of the things that is absolutely clear is that history shows us that we can do this. The focus of the image that I've just got on the screen at the moment is the Gateshead Millennium Bridge. That wasn't installed to address safety concerns about the number of people swimming across the river at that point, or based on data that indicated it was demand-led. It was vision-led, so this can be done. As professionals who've taken the time out to spend an hour on this call, it's clear we all care about what we're doing, and what I'm saying is that we need to challenge ourselves and each other to improve upon this scenario, both technically and politically, to empower ourselves and our politicians and square this approach to business case development and economic modelling with a vision-led view of where to invest and what to invest in. Again, it can be done, and the Millennium Bridge is not the only example in our area. There are many in the past. Monument in Newcastle used to be a roundabout. Northumberland Street used to be the main road. Certainly doesn't look like that now. This is the summer from earlier on this summer during the pandemic and the phased reopening. But the examples aren't just in the past. There's many emerging at the moment across the country, and in this region it can be seen in places like Northumberland leading the development of a new train line for economic and not just transport purposes, to Sunderland pushing forward really ambitious plans for their urban area. In Newcastle we're proposing big changes too. We've already made big changes in the allocation of road space quite quickly, both in response to COVID and in seeking to chart a new way forward for our city. And we're trying to do so by using temporary changes that lead us to something longer term. In comparison to most of our careers, I'd expect that the speed of change people are seeing, not just in terms of the underlying assumptions and ideas we have to consider, but in terms of actual changes on the ground, is faster than any we've seen. While officers do a lot of the legwork, supported by consultants where appropriate, these are all politically led initiatives when you get down to it. And in simple terms, we're trying to link temporary changes to longer-term vision-led initiatives. These last two slides have been part of our discussions with political leadership, and it's been based around three things when we first discussed it. One, providing a brief reminder of the scale of the challenge we face, considering both short and long-term trends and issues. Two, how we can use this chance to change to enable or deliver on wider ambitions and objectives. And then third, getting down to the detail of what changes we propose and how we intend to work with wider stakeholders to develop more plans to move us forward. Having those discussions early in the pandemic enabled us to gain understanding and political oversight and leadership for a programme that is ultimately directed towards improving our places. And that political sphere is absolutely essential to us all in moving forward, because it's clear that one of the best ways of ensuring a vision-led approach to investment and placemaking is through a democratic system where a person or people are elected based on a manifesto to make certain changes, and then are empowered with sufficient funding to make those things happen. Yes, we need to deliver value for public money and provide assurance around that, of course we do, but does the current system enable us to be as expansive as we need to be in our thinking, or does it constrain us to more traditional ways of working? Bearing in mind the points raised earlier about the potential for triple access planning and the changes to work patterns, it's local trips and those up to 5 miles that not only have the most opportunity to shift the dial on air quality and climate change, but there's no uncertainty that those intra-city measures have the biggest impact on the majority of people's day-to-day lives. In terms of the funding, there's a few things to draw attention to. First, I'd be interested to know what people's views are on whether the current system tends to prioritise those major national projects of intercity importance over local schemes with intra-city focus. Would a challenge to the status quo be seen to jeopardise big national schemes, and if so, how to manage that, given the various stakeholders? Second, to compound the current rules of the games we have to play that I've referred to in terms of use of NTEM, TAG, externally assured business cases that need to provide high value for money, we also have funding frameworks based on short-term windows of bidding for a multitude of separate departmental funds with different evaluation and monitoring schemes and systems over different time spans. This undermines our ability to plan strategically and leverage further investment. The reality is, certainly from my experience, that you make progress towards a longer-term plan by learning to play the game as opposed to spending your time focused on changing that game. But at the moment, the system means we don't get as far or as fast as we could. And in the context of the challenges we face, we collectively need to consider if that's the right way for us to work, and if not, what we can do about it. But interestingly, I mean, this slide, it dates back to 2010 in terms of when people were thinking that we needed to target travel behaviour change. And bearing in mind the point about people as numbers earlier and that different funding streams have different requirements, can we as a profession say, hand on heart, that we monitor all of our initiatives and interventions appropriately? Do we always robustly evaluate if things did what we meant them to do or what their other impacts were? The answer has to be, if we're honest, that we don't. And in part, that's because our revenue budgets as local authorities have been decimated in the past 10 years. As a more general rule, investors in people as a business kite mark would be based on proving you had processes in place and implemented them that ensured you spent the same amount of time in 3 different areas of work: to plan, to do, to review. That should become a self-sustaining and increasingly efficient way of working, and I think it's worth revisiting in the context of how to ensure we get the most out of the future. I wonder how many of the businesses and individuals taking part in the session today would genuinely be able to agree that they or their businesses are approaching things in that way. Another aspect of that is whether or not in the current funding context such an approach is genuinely needed, or whether it's something that the existing frameworks and funding processes allow to be something to be nodded at without ever fully engaging with. One thing that has started to change through this period, though, is that additional data sources have been made more available to local transport authorities, and this could have a really significant impact on how we manage and plan our cities' networks. Though interestingly, as authorities, we're often not set up with the right skill sets to adequately analyse all the data and draw conclusions. But this isn't just about skill sets, it also relates back to time. Because of the pressures on all our time, we need to make it easier for ourselves. I referenced earlier whether or not people and businesses would be spending time planning, doing and reviewing, or whether or not in these times the focus is more on simply getting by while trying to move in the right direction. I think this video does a great job, in my view, of showing us both that in some ways it can be quite easy to change people's travel behaviour, but conversely also that people take the path of least resistance. With the first wave of changes we made to our city's road space by rapidly reallocating space towards more active ways of getting around, we tried to adopt a position of plan, do, review, improve. I think we managed that well to a degree. The challenge is maintaining that momentum within a group of people who are tired and trying their best to keep their head above water. The level of work and expectations is such that we have to regularly hold our hands up to where we can improve things. The reality is the time constraints after a sustained period of austerity in local authorities, while coupled with ongoing but inconsistent and time-critical funding approaches, means we don't always have the opportunity to go back to first principles in the way Decide and Provide indicates. Or that if we do, can we always bring our stakeholders with us when it's difficult to properly engage with people when there's no certainty of funding? And this is where the importance of what we say and how we say it to local stakeholders becomes critical. A great way of describing this was outlined in a recent article by John Dales in Local Transport Today about loss aversion, social proof and the pratfall effect. Essentially, that people are always going to fear the loss of what they have more than the potential of what they can gain. Further, that people tend to follow the reactions of their neighbours because they genuinely care about what other people think. And then finally, that it's important for people in positions of powers or decision making to not always be right and to hold their hands up when they're wrong. And on that, it's really important that when we're trying to engage with people about pretty bold and longer term ambitions for our city, that we do so honestly and transparently as far as we can in terms of our communication. If people are interested in some specific examples of what we've done and how we've done it, I can pick them up through the questions. Thanks all very much for your time.
That's great. Thanks, Graham. Thanks, Annette, and thanks, Glenn. 3 great talks and presentations there. Some real food for thought. Somewhat disappointingly, not a flying car in sight, but let's not dwell. Maybe just a personal perspective there. So I can see we've got lots of questions coming in. So I'm going to dive straight into the Q&A portal, and I'll start with someone asking a question. So if I want to CPO someone's house for, let's say, a rail scheme, if I embrace uncertainty and say I don't know in 30 years time whether rail demand is more likely to be 40% lower or 40% higher, how can I explain that to a planning inspector? I don't know who to put that to. I'll put that to you, Glenn, if you don't mind, to start with, and then maybe Annette and Graham, you could chip in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to give a quote, which I hope doesn't sound glib, but I think it applies across everything you've heard in this session. And it actually comes from a French philosopher in the 1600s, and I think it is very appropriate for the territory that we're now exploring. And he said, uncertainty is an uncomfortable position, but certainty is an absurd one. And I'm afraid to say we've been operating in a rather absurd set of circumstances for a little while now in transport planning, whether it's the analysis we do or the evidence presented to the planning inspector or the understanding that we offer to our politicians. Now, what I'm really coming to here is that you're touching upon one of those areas of extreme discomfort. It would be lovely to have to 2 decimal places an indication of future rail demand, and to feel confident you've got a benefit cost ratio that's going to leave everyone happy and the public purse is being used wisely, and therefore that CPO makes sense, or it doesn't. But you'd be being disingenuous, frankly, right now. And what we're seeing is moving more broadly to the approach the Department for Transport itself is exploring and trying to adopt, is recognizing that the value for money category for a scheme, for example, could be affected by the different futures that you start to base your analysis upon. So whereas we've had a long tradition of, as Graham and others have mentioned, a central projection mentality, where somehow we're deluded into thinking that must be the most likely future, what DFT are now doing are developing what they call common analytical scenarios. And the idea is that particularly for major schemes, we should be seeing an approach that tests those schemes against the different common analytical scenarios to see how that affects the value for money category. And I would just come back to another point in one of the other questions I've seen about TAG. You know, the key point in TAG is the G stands for guidance, not rules that have to be followed to the absolute undeviating letter. The frustration DFT itself has is that there isn't enough lateral interpretation of that guidance to suit the circumstances that one's dealing with.
Excellent, thanks, Glenn. Annette, Graham, anything to add?
I think I would just add on to Glenn's point, the importance of scenarios and thinking about that going forward in terms of the increasing need for us to think about future scenarios and future plausible scenarios, and hoping that that kind of approach will increasingly become part of the lexicon of our industry.
Excellent.
And I think what I'd add, if I can, is that we need to be clear on what the different people's roles are within this as well, because I agree with Glenn's point. But equally, you need to understand what the politician's position is as a decision maker and how we kind of raise their levels of understanding of what we're asking them to agree based on different levels of certainty or uncertainty. We need to try and make sure that we're continuing to train local authority officers, and equally that the consultants who are on the call recognise what their role is, and that is as a consultant to this process, not just necessarily to do exactly as the client asks, but to challenge them to put forward different ways of thinking and to try and deliver the best solution and future for the area that they're working with.
Excellent, thanks, guys. I'll move on to another question if you don't mind. How do I convince the National Audit Office that my vision is value for money? Annette, do you want to have a first go at that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. There's lots of questions here that are kind of speaking to the same kind of difficult challenges that we're all facing within our job roles. And I think, again, this comes back for me to thinking about our visions and making sure that they're shared, and that stakeholders are kind of supportive of them. It goes back to Graham's point about bringing people, your political leaders, into the discussions. And I think then when you've got a vision that is politically supported, and then you can do the business case around that, then that's what we obviously need to be doing, is linking this vision-led approach to the business cases that we're developing. And but it's about developing shared visions alongside the stakeholders that we work with. And I think, interestingly, that isn't just about the political kind of decision makers that we work alongside. It's also talking to our citizens about what vision do they see for their cities, and that's increasingly important in terms of getting acceptance for the kind of visions that we're talking about, and communicating to our citizens about decarbonisation and what that really means.
Yeah, thanks, Annette. Graham, I guess that must be very much on your horizon in terms of how to get that type of both political and I guess operational buy-in to these sort of future strategies in your role as head of transport investment at Newcastle.
It is, and I think that there's a couple of different things on it. Building on experience from engaging with the public and stakeholders about what you're trying to point us in the direction to do, and also bearing in mind the National Audit Office question, how good we are at monitoring and evaluation, which I tried to pick up in my presentation earlier. And we have to recognise that local authorities who are responsible for this stuff have been decimated in terms of their revenue funding over the past 10 years, and don't necessarily have either the skill sets or the employees in place to try and do that. But again, I guess, looking more positively to the future, one of the things that has emerged is the amount of data that's out there is incredible. And it's often referred to as like soil because it's so fertile as opposed to being oil. And one of the things that'd be great to see come out of this pandemic is a better way for local transport authorities and local highways authorities to work either in partnership with private sector consultancies and or other businesses who own things like mobile phone data and things like that, to really underpin how effective the measures that they've put in place have been, and other things. I mean, we're working and looking at what different people's spend are on their Visa cards, and also the mobility and where they've been going to through the pandemic, to understand how different retail patterns are shifting and so on. And that's stuff that would have taken us a lot longer to try and get through frameworks for whether or not we're going to do this stuff previously. And because of the pandemic, we've massively accelerated how quick we can make decisions, frankly, as a local authority, because everything is so present and upfront and with us, that it means that decisions have to be made, and you just recognise that if you get them wrong, you hold your hands up, you try to change it and improve it, and then you move on. And that's across the board. I think in terms of stakeholder engagement, again, and selling that vision or trying to promote it, it is a difficult one. And I don't know if other questions will come up about it, but there just has, my experience suggests that there just has to be a recognition that you're not going to please everybody. And consultation doesn't mean changing the scheme to adhere to everybody's view of what it needs to be, or the future to everybody's view of what it needs to be, because you simply can't, and then you deliver compromise schemes that won't deliver what you intended them to in the first place. But that is a very difficult thing, and that is why, again, I come back to one of the most important things apart from all of this, and that we'll all have learned over the past few months, is the importance of strong political leadership in terms of delivering the type of future that we need.
Excellent, thank you. Glenn, I'm going to put the next question to you. I think it picks up on some of the points that you've all been just talking about there, but someone's asked a question. I wonder if the speakers believe there's a skills gap in transport planning in relation to communication. Having a vision is one thing, but selling that to politicians and communities requires specific skills and understanding. Do you feel that's the case, Glenn? Is that being addressed within the profession?
I think that's a very well-placed question. I think there is a skills gap. I think, encouragingly, in my years in transport planning, I've seen the mix of skills, the mix of people types and their disciplinary backgrounds evolving, and I think it's evolving in the right direction. We're we're a discipline that has its roots in engineering and economics, but increasingly, we see geography, anthropology, social psychology, and so on coming in, and that enriches our capabilities. Of course, it doesn't address Graham's point about the quantum of skills that we have available, but on communication particularly, yes, I think it's a challenging skill and a very necessary one now, particularly as we deal with, frankly, a series of wicked problems. We are not dealing with straightforward black and white, this is good, that's bad, here's how we deliver it, here's the BCR. We understand increasingly, I think, that we're wrestling with, even if one looks at the triple access system, whilst it's I like to think, a compelling model in terms of its simplicity, the devil, of course, is in the detail, because we have all sorts of changes going on. And from individuals' perspectives, ultimately, they are typically are concerned about change. Change tends to signal upheaval and risk to their daily lives that may be negative rather than positive. And it needs the type of communication that Graham's illustrated well today, to really try and encourage people to open their minds and see change that can be for the better, and take some confidence in that, may be involving some transitional phase. But, again, the pandemic has underlined the human capacity to adapt, as well as us not feeling comfortable with change.
Annette, is it from a consultancy perspective, and maybe just picking up on that, is that communication side of things becoming way more prevalent in terms of how we get the messages across, how we support our clients with those kind of new ideas and ways of delivering our work?
Yeah, I mean, I really like this question. I had a new starter last year, and when I did her induction, she said, "Oh, if I'd have known, 8 years ago that transport planning was so interesting, I'd have really wanted to do it, but I've kind of fallen into it. But it's and she said it's fascinating, and it's not just about, like what Glenn was saying about engineering, it's about so many different aspects. And I think we need to be better at selling what transport planning is. And there's a really good talk, TED talk by Simon Sinek called Why. And it's that sort of like, why are we doing what we're doing? And we're doing it because, we need to address the decarbonisation challenge. We want lives to be better. All those types of good reasons why we all enjoy transport and transport planning. And I think there's a real need now, particularly with climate change, to be able to communicate to the public and to politicians, because I just, in order to get the message across clearly and accurately as well, I think we need to be working really closely with climate change communicators and who are used to working in this field, and then to bring that into the transport planning profession would really strengthen us, I think.
If I could just add, Phil, I think one of the best decisions I made early on at the council was to bring in 2 engagement officers who, again, instead of necessarily selling a scheme, they're involving people and listening to their views on it, and removing the engineers from that process and putting in people who are trained in actually listening and talking to people has made a big difference. It isn't to say that we win people's hearts and minds all the time, but I think that whether or not they agree with what we're doing or not, hopefully they feel that they have actually been heard. The other thing that I think is really important in terms of this is the try before you buy, which I think Glenn intimated earlier on, and the use of experimental traffic regulation orders is really important in these kind of short-term initiatives, because it can change people's minds. Because again, the fear of loss of what you previously had versus what you actually experience when something changes is quite different. We've got a local example in the Garden Village where, for example, we asked if they wanted us to shut a small bridge, which would have been a massive diversion when we closed the main road for some maintenance works. 2/3 of the residents said that they didn't want it shut. A third said that they did. We went to do it. When we went back, during the closure, about a year into the closure, to ask them if they thought they wanted it closed in the longer term, that had shifted to 2/3 wanting a form of restriction there in the longer term, and only a third thereafter. So people can change, and that initial reaction to something being bad it can lessen over time when they get to experience it. And then I think the third thing that I'd note is just to reiterate what Annette said about having purpose behind what you're doing, and also trying to really clearly communicate that purpose. And I think one of the things that particularly consultancies could be really, really good at is trying to break down very long, wordy documents, which is our kind of bread and butter, and simple to understand, easily digestible things that you can show politicians or the public or anybody else that explains what you're doing very quickly. And I think we could all improve on that.
Excellent, thank you. I think we've got time perhaps for one final question, and I think it's kind of asking, you know, who out there is a kind of an exemplar, who's doing this really well at the minute. Graham, do you want to, is there anybody that Newcastle kind of look towards and think, well, actually that's that's kind of forward looking, some innovation over there that we might try to replicate? Is there anyone who stands out?
You know what, it's a hard question, and I wouldn't say that there's one place that stands out. I'd like to think actually that there is a bit of a groundswell behind a lot of urban areas at the moment who are trying to do this stuff. We look to Manchester in terms of what some of the things that they've done, Edinburgh and others, but equally we look to our neighbours in North Tyneside and what they did with the Sunrise Cycleway, and I'm sure they look at us and think that we're examples of good practice in other ways as well. We often look overseas to areas in Canada in particular, and certain other cities in Europe. And I think one of the interesting things that we've done, particularly when you look at kind of cycling levels or walking levels, which are really important, because I think the future to some degree is in walking and cycling as compared to automation and flying cars and things like that, is actually comparing things like how flat our city is in comparison to areas like the Netherlands and how cold and rainy it is. Because one of the things that people immediately throw back at you is, yeah, well, we're not Utrecht or we're not Amsterdam, we're not Copenhagen. And actually being able to have some of the things immediately to respond to that is important. I guess one of the things where I'd like to think that we're an exemplar is how closely aligned with our public health, our Director of Public Health and our Public Health Department. And that has improved our ability to try and communicate about this, because it's amazing, even before this pandemic, the difference that it can make when I'm going to propose a cycling scheme, that I go to a rowdy public meeting stood next to the Director of Public Health because they agree with what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Glenn, Annette, anything you'd like to raise as examples of or exemplars of good practice?
I think there's an important distinction between the process that is followed in different cities or by different countries and the specific visions that they may set out and seek to fulfill. There's a great article I read earlier this year that compared San Francisco with Stockholm. San Francisco very much being billed as the global smart city, in the heart of Silicon Valley, and Stockholm being billed as the sustainable city. They both have directly elected mayors. So in a sense, the processes at their disposal could be similar, but the outcomes, what they're aspiring to be seen as and to achieve, could be very different. And I think, as Graham's mentioned, Manchester is a good example in the UK of taking a vision-led approach. Of course, it also has some great examples of specific policies and measures that others might look to adopt. But I think what I'm encouraged by, the glib answer to that question is there aren't really any cast iron examples elsewhere nationally or globally, because if there were, we'd all have grabbed them with both hands and adopted them and applied them and enjoy the success. So the reality is always difficult. It needs to be tailored to the area concerned. But I think I am encouraged that there are an increasing number of authorities recognising this type of approach is the right one for the circumstances.
Yeah, I'd just give a quick flag to the kind of the work that is being done around sort of like 20-minute cities and things like that. That sort of aligns to the triple access system and spatial proximity. And I think that there will be cities that are doing things well in certain aspects, and I think that the 20-minute city is worth looking at, I think, in terms of a developing area.
Brilliant, thanks, Annette. So I think we're about to hit our time limit here, so I'll look to draw this to a close. There's some questions there that we haven't been able to get around to. We will try and respond to those and get those responses out via email or social media over the next day or so. So I'd just like to thank Glenn, Annette and Graham for their time and really insightful presentations, which give us all a flavour as to what that future mobility may look like. up on the screen there. Look out for future Mott MacDonald webinars. The next one due to be held on the 3rd of December, entitled The Future of Hospital Design. It's going to look at some of the challenges and the opportunities our healthcare system will look to embrace in the future. So please keep an eye out for that on social media and register via Eventbrite if that's of interest to you. So thank you very much for your time today and taking the time to join us. I hope you found it informative and helpful. So until next time, stay happy, stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.